AI in Action is brought to you by Alldus International, covering your business's staffing, consulting, and networking needs. Our host brings you the leading minds in AI, sharing their story, their success, and their advice. Focusing on fast-tracking you to the top, AI in Action cuts through the hype to help you kickstart your data science career. To listen to the latest AI in Action podcast, head over to www.alldus.com/podcast or subscribe via iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Podcasts.
You're listening to AI in Action. I'm your host, JP Valentine. Today, we're joined by two people. We have Frank Zenie, who is chairman of the Zenie Group and founder of Zymark Group. Zymark were pioneers in laboratory robotic automation. And we also have Chelsea Weidman Burke. Chelsea is a freelance writer for many publications. She's contributed to BioSpace, Harvard University Science in the News, compassionate technologist, and Chelsea is also a lab technician in a medical school. Chelsea and Frank, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Guys, what I'd like to do is just start by having you both give a brief overview of your background and your roles, which will help paint a bigger picture of what we're going to cover today, as it's specifically focused on lab automation. Frank, if we could start with yourself, obviously, for those of you who are not familiar with Frank, it's an incredible background, but if you could give a brief overview of your company and some of the impacts that you've had in lab automation.
Okay, thanks, JP. I was trained as an engineer and ended up working at what was then called Waters Associates, which is now Waters Corporation. And we were pioneers in many ways in the field of HPLC for laboratory chromatography. And during that time, I had a chance to experience the growth of new technology and what it meant to laboratories. When Waters was acquired by Millipore Corporation, one of my coworkers, Burley Hutchins, and I formed Zymark Corporation. And we formed it by going out and speaking with people who were senior people in analytical laboratories, and we sought out what were their unmet needs. We didn't ask them what they wanted, we asked them what problems they had, and one of our favorite questions was, what keeps you up at night? That led us to discovering that while there was strong advances in analytical instrumentation, the role of sample preparation had fallen behind, and it was a rate limiting and error causing step. And so we started out with the mission of how can we bring some technology and automation to sample preparation to make the entire laboratory process more effective. And that led us to use the use of robotics and a computer architecture that surrounded the robotics with workstations that performed typical laboratory functions. So I've grown up in the development of the scientific analytical techniques as well as the automation, and have some perspective in terms of how it can be more effective going forward.
Amazing. So to summarize, you're one of the reasons that lab automation happened back when you founded Zymark in the early 80s, and you guys were sort of the front runners and trailblazers in many ways to revolutionize that industry. Is that a fair thing to say? I know you're pretty modest, but you guys sort of changed the game in many respects.
Well, I think so, because it was all manual at the time, and people accepted it because that's the way it had always been. And putting a robot on a laboratory bench was not at the top of anyone's thought at the time. And then we with our pioneering customers, we learned together how to make that more useful over time. So the technology evolved with real customers trying to solve real problems.
Amazing. Well, thank you for that. We can certainly come back to some of the challenges you faced in a little bit, but I want to bring Chelsea in. Chelsea, you and I have obviously been speaking for quite some time now, but I want to first give you the opportunity to talk about some of the work you're involved in, then which would lead nicely into how you and I connected based on an article where you talked about the future of lab automation. So if you could please just give some context as to some of the great work you do.
Yeah, so I am trained as a biochemist. I am currently a laboratory technician, so I do a lot of bench work and a lot of pipetting. So I actually worked in a company called Adbion Inc., which works with mass spectrometry, which is another kind of analysis method in the chemistry lab. And that's through that I actually met Frank when I was a freshman in college. So it's been a while that we've known each other, but it all came full circle when I was writing an article for BioSpace. So I'm also a freelance science writer, and I write for BioSpace. So this article was focused on laboratory automation, kind of where it's at. Nobody really kind of talks about it as much in the media, which kind of surprised me when I was doing my research, because it's a whole really interesting and really upcoming field to kind of start to automate everything. We look around ourselves, like technology's everywhere. You know, we have a phone in our pocket and probably a tablet, a laptop, smart technology in our homes now. Everything's becoming automated, but it's kind of slowly seeping into the life sciences. I guess more slowly than I would think. It's more prevalent in kind of higher like biopharma and larger pharmaceutical companies for sure. But especially in academia, it hasn't quite, trickled down to being commonplace. Now, HPLCs are definitely a common thing to have in the lab now, but some things more like automated kind of liquid robotics and liquid handling. So I guess one of my favorite quotes that I found while researching for this article was from Will Canine, the co-founder of an automated lab equipment company called Ulpentrons. He said, basically, if you're a biologist, you spend all of your time moving tiny amounts of liquid around from vial to vial by hand with a little micropipette, or you can have a robot that does it for you. I think that kind of sums up exactly what is happening in terms of the dichotomy between a scientist and a robot. So by freeing up the scientist's hands and having a robot do your pipetting and some of your analysis and experimentation, you can free up your time to do the actual kind of science meaty portion of it, the data analysis, answering these scientific questions faster, analyzing huge sets of data, which now we're currently generating because big data is now possible, in terms of the omics, genomics, metabolomics, proteomics. We're generating huge amounts of data, and then we need to find a way to parse through it to find meaningful things. So robotics and lab automation can really help not only in the data generation, but also in how you manage your data and data storage. Another part that I think automation will help greatly is that you can increase your productivity and speed up your experiments. You can also increase the reproducibility of your results. So reproducibility is kind of a huge problem that scientists are currently facing. So a survey from Nature in 2016 reported that more than 70% of scientists fail to reproduce another scientist's experiments, and more than half fail to even reproduce their own experiments. So I thought those figures were kind of astonishing, but I can easily see, being at the bench, how there are so many things that go into experiments, let alone more complex things like drug development in biopharma, that it's just so hard to make it reproducible, and that can lead to problems. If you can't reproduce something, how can you be sure that the data is correct, and you don't want to base a drug off of faulty data, for example. So it's important to note that although lab automation will definitely help in reproducibility, I still think there's still some human aspect to it, of course, how stock solutions are made, or buffers, timing, tricks that humans can do with the pipette that maybe robots aren't as adept to do yet. Lab automation will definitely help, and it's a step in the right direction, but there are still things that can be improved in terms of lab automation.
Amazing. Well, look, thank you so much for that overview, both of you. For anyone who's looking to check out that article, it is How Automation Will Bring Biopharma Research into the 21st Century. You'll find it on BioSpace. Highly recommend it. It's what triggered this podcast episode. So what I'd be interested, Frank, to get your perspective on some of the challenges you faced early on, and now that we're looking at this next wave of advanced automation, what challenges do you see now that we need to get over in order to take it to the next level?
Well, I think the biggest issue is trying to over-automate, and people get there with the mission of saying the purpose of automation is to replace people. And I've learned the hard way over many, many projects that automation ought to be looked at in context of a way of machines and computers working with people, and we ought to use the machines and computers where they're very good and not expect them to do the jobs that people are very good at. And so I think from a laboratory perspective, I think automation has been very successful when it's been used as sort of a workstation. So if you go back into chromatography in the earlier labs, the very first things you got were auto samplers that did the simple job of addressing a group of samples, taking them one at a time and introducing them into the instrument at the appropriate time. And that gave both higher quality sample introduction as well as a tremendous labor saving, because the person could go off and do serious work while the machine was going through a set of samples. We then had integrators. You probably don't know, but in the very beginning, people used to use a straight edge and a pencil and draw triangles around chromatographic peaks and estimate the area under the peak, or try to use peak height to quantify the data. So chromatographic integrators were a step in automation. This goes on into the sample prep area, and particularly the areas that Chelsea is talking about, sample pipetting, which are highly repetitive, require a lot of precision, and particularly with the advent of the 96 well microplate, you had a format that was ideally suited for automation. So I think if we look at lab automation as a series of steps that can be automated and not worry about whether or not a person gets involved every now and then, I think automation will be very successful. It'll be cost effective and reliable and robust under a laboratory environment.
Chelsea, given the research you focused on for the article, you talked about some of the challenges and roadblocks. If the industry as a whole really got behind this and like we're seeing with a lot of other industries now, embrace and adopt automation for changing business processes, if that was to happen within lab automation and we've seen those advancements again, what would be the big, most noticeable changes be for the industry as a whole, and then for the wider the wider industry of patient research and overall hospital care?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think what I mostly focused on was kind of biopharma, so thinking about it from a drug perspective. So it's actually interesting to note that you can think of automation as, of course, it will greatly improve the quality of drugs, if you improve the reproducibility and the scale that you can even produce these drugs on. So if you think about it from a scale point of view, the faster we can screen a whole bunch of small molecules to see, does it target this particular protein, which is involved somehow in a disease, the faster we might be able to find something that helps either bind to the protein and, ameliorate the symptoms of the disease, and that will kind of speed up the process of drug discovery, which can therefore lead to quicker times to get from bench to person. You can also think of it in terms of the kind of newer technology companies. So Moderna, they study and mRNA therapies. They couldn't do what they are doing without automation. Same thing with synthetic biology company Ginkgo Bioworks. They all require automation to actually optimize their design and deliver their products. So precision medicine, cell-based therapies, these are all going to be made possible and faster by using automation widely and getting better at seeing, what can be automated and making sure to not over-automate. That is important as well.
Yeah, I think it's funny timing that we're having this conversation off the recent HBO documentary where it talked about obviously the Theranos situation, where with life sciences, with lab automation, and this is an industry where you can't fake it till you make it, and you've got to take the necessary steps to ensure that the quality is never at risk, because this is not making a smartphone run faster or a GPS work better. There's no margin for error. Hence why we need to focus on the quality at all costs. But it's great to hear that these companies are out there and they're still trying to push the boundaries with lab automation to improve the overall quality. Guys, just a final point, just to bring this all around for the people who are listening, who are, our audience are particularly focused on AI, data science, and this is clearly aimed at the automation and the robotic space, and people who have a particular interest in life sciences. So for those guys who are interested in learning more about where this is started and where we're going to, what should they be looking on, whether it's groups or websites? Where can they focus their attention to learn more about this topic?
Some information that I'm about to say was actually provided by Andy Zayenga. He's the executive chair of the Laboratory Research and Innovation Group, or LRIG. That's a professional society focusing on laboratory automation. He mentioned that there are two kind of particularly interesting companies that he thought would be notable to follow. So one of them is called Elemental Machines, and it uses an AI-powered platform to connect lab instruments and processes together. He said it was one of the hottest companies in the IoT, or Internet of Things, field for lab automation right now. Blue Chip is also another company that uses secure wireless ID and temperature tracking. So this is one point that hasn't been brought up yet, but biobanking and kind of sample automation. If you collect a bunch of biological samples, they are very temperature sensitive and time sensitive, so they have to be stored correctly, but they also have to be trackable and labeled, kind of like a package. You want to know, if the sample was taken from patient A, they want to be able to track it, 5 or 10 years later and still be able to know where the sample came from. So using kind of Blue Chip kind of uses this interesting microelectromechanical system, or MEMS chip technology, where the tracking tag is actually embedded in the container, so it can't ever be lost, like a barcode or label could fall off, which is really important because you're storing these samples in extreme temperatures, usually really, really cold, minus 80 or below, to keep samples for longer. So sometimes this can cause barcodes or labels to fall off, that kind of thing. You can also check out, Andy manages the International Society for Biological and Environmental Repositories, or ISPER's biobanking network Twitter, and there is also a weekly news digest from both LRIG and ISPER, particularly on biobanking, that kind of summarizes what's out there, what's currently being said about biobanking and lab automation. So I think following LRIG and ISPER on social media would be a good place to start.
Amazing. We will be sure to look out for that. Guys, well, listen, it's been an absolute pleasure. Really enjoyed the conversation. I've enjoyed learning about where we've come from at lab automation and what's in store. And I think the timing of this podcast is really good to talk about all the positives that's happening behind the scenes. So Frank and Chelsea, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
You're very welcome.
Thank you so much for hosting us.
AI in Action is brought to you by Alldus International, covering your business's staffing, consulting, and networking needs. Alldus offer an exec search program. Alldus can help you discover how data science and AI can transform your company. With our unrivaled network of C-suite executives and senior AI professionals, we offer retained search services across the US and Europe. Get the Alldus advantage. Become a member of the Alldus community and enjoy some of the following: AI meetups. Once a month, our community gathers to listen to some of the leading experts in the world of data science and AI. Our speakers come from all over the world, including Dublin, Boston, and Frankfurt. We also have our AI mentors. Our experts will provide mentoring to Alldus members. And don't forget our AI in Action podcast. Each week, we have guests from all over the world talking us through their education, career, and more. Become an Alldus member and get the Alldus advantage. For more information and to sign up for our newsletter, log on to www.alldus.com. That's www.alldus.com. Alldus International, empowering through AI.